Welcome to a very special episode of Trail Talk. I'm Cole Noble for Cole's Climb. This podcast has always been about highlighting those who are doing cool things that make the outdoors a better place for all of us. And since we're coming up on Colorado Gives Day, which is the first Tuesday of each December, I thought it would be a great opportunity to speak with a handful of groups who are doing all that great work in the outdoor space, who could maybe use your support right now. You don't need to be in Colorado to contribute, and even if donating is not something that you're able to do right now, I think this conversation still offers a really interesting look at the future of the outdoor community and why the fight for conservation and access is changing so much. First up is Lloyd Athearn, joining us from the Colorado 14ers Initiative. Those of you who have seen my documentary, The Alpine Amusement Park, are already probably pretty accustomed to Lloyd's voice. We talked to him extensively about the CFI work that they're doing into preserving these really popular trails. Today, though, the conversation is a bit different. We're focused on the future, the work that CFI is looking to accomplish, and why it's getting more complicated to get done.
Well, I've been executive director of the Colorado 14ers Initiative for 14 years now, sort of an interesting numerical year with us. And in that, I've kind of grown the organization a lot and taken on more trail projects. We're expanding into greater ways to impact the 14ers through education and acquisition of private lands that are at threat to have closures, those sorts of things.
So this is something that you and I have talked about, obviously, a little bit before we got on here. At length, we've talked about some of the work that CFI has been doing. And I think that it's interesting to see how much your job has really grown into a much bigger effort to conserve the outdoors. Because as you told me, I think a year ago when we first talked, when you took over, you had these kind of guesstimates of how many people were hiking and were kind of relying on hand tally counters to try to figure out how many people were on the trails. And it's, as you said, has evolved into a very sophisticated operation where you can be very precise about the impact of the hikers, and the work that you're doing is offsetting, the environmental damage or degradation for potentially hundreds of thousands of people every year. And I think it's cool to see how that's grown, but I imagine that as your organization has grown, the need for funding for more of the projects has kind of grown with it. Am I correct in my guess there?
Yeah, for a whole bunch of different reasons, right? So when CFI got started in the mid-90s, we have always been a partner principally of the Forest Service. There are a few peaks that are on the Bureau of Land Management lands, but we were largely doing what they wanted us to do and start building out a network of 14er trails. And initially, most of the routes that people were climbing on the 53 to 58 peaks were just unplanned climbers taking the path of least resistance, no thought to long-term sustainability of travel through very fragile alpine ecosystems. And so it was a couple of, very specific projects. And as we've gotten more and more done, the use has expanded, hugely. And so you have this need to maintain a bigger network of trails. The easier fruit was essentially picked in the early years. And so now when we're taking on projects, instead of it being a 1 year, $125,000 project, it's now a 6 year, $2 million project that involved buying lands to allow the trail to legally proceed, those sorts of things. We're just seeing more and more challenges as more people are on the trails, and we're still focusing as much on the actual work on the trail, but we're seeing that some of the greater needs might now be the trail and trailhead. How do you get large numbers of people to a trailhead that might go over a four-wheel drive road and a very small parking area, which was suitable 20 years ago, and now you have far more people parking along the road. So how do we improve the trailhead facilities? Are there toilet facilities or camping management near a trailhead? The game has just gotten more complicated, and the number of people on the trails has expanded as well. When we first started doing our estimates in 2015, we thought there were like 260,000 people. In 2020, we were up to 415,000 during the pandemic when seemingly everyone came to Colorado to climb a 14er. You know, we had some issues in 2021 that dropped it down to 303,000, but, you know, still a large chunk of people out there, and spread throughout the whole season.
I think it's interesting to think about trail work as something that goes beyond just, you know, what someone might expect, where you're clearing the trail and doing maintenance and making sure it's not washed out. Because as you said, there's some obviously low-hanging fruit to get to in the beginning, where you're developing the real heavy-duty, high-traffic trails. And I think the testament to the durable power of the work that you guys have been doing, is that over time, Quandary is one of the examples that I talked about in the documentary project I just did recently, where even as use almost doubled on the trail, while you guys were working on it, the trail condition went from, you know, a C to an A minus. So even with all those extra people on the trail, if the trail is built sufficiently, it's not necessarily a question of how many people and how many boots are on the ground, but, you know, whether those people are following trail etiquette and how we're getting them up to the mountain. So I think it's interesting to expand the conversation a little bit, to start talking about not just the trails themselves, but how do we get there? How are the roads? How are the facilities around the trail? Kind of the other tangential points of where people have an environmental impact that isn't just, you know, walking across the tundra.
Yeah, and we're starting to see that in a number of areas, but most especially in our, you know, most climbed front range or frontish range peaks, where, you know, good example is Grays and Torreys peaks, which are always in kind of the top 5 most climbed routes. That's one where the road is a fairly narrow, often heavily rutted road, small trailhead parking area with an antiquated pit toilet. We also find on that mountain, which is generally getting use in kind of like, you know, 25 to 35,000 people a year, based on, you know, which year we're talking about, and whether it's a good accessible year or one that has snowpack or wildfire smoke closures, those sorts of things. There's very little rock source on the mountain, especially high on the mountain. So we quickly exhausted the buildable size rocks. So then we started to have to use these metal wire baskets called gabions that get filled with smaller rocks. And so that's allowing us to do stabilization work up high. But then we were having a challenge with protecting the actual trail. We didn't have rocks that would allow us to put in steps and staircases. So we needed to get large timbers about 12 feet in width up there. And there was no way humanly possible that we could have humans carry them up a couple of miles to get there. So this early this season, we were like, can we hire a helicopter to fly logs up there? So we're having to figure out, how do we get over 20,000 pounds of logs, so about 70 plus logs up there. Thankfully, we were able to find a helicopter service, take them and fly them up to almost 13,000 feet so we could install them and stabilize the trail. But then we're also dealing with, you know, just the whole getting people to and from there in a safe and responsible manner. How do you manage camping at the trailheads? So the conversation has gone from the trail to the trail plus all of these other things that come into getting people there, and how to do it efficiently, effectively, and equitably as well.
I think Grays and Torreys, I'm glad you brought that up, because if you didn't, I would have. I remember seeing the video of your airlift, and I remember talking with one of your trail crew workers, Taylor, who was talking about how I think there was conversation of how on some trails you guys have used animals to carry some of the larger timbers, but that obviously on Grays and Torreys, there's a lot of really skinny, difficult to pass areas where that might not work. And I think that Grays and Torreys too is just such a good example, because you're right, it has that kind of small lot that's built on the old mining claim. You've got some of the trail is good because it's on the mining road. Then you've got a shortage of material up high, and then Stevens Gulch is a scary road for some drivers. I remember the first time I saw it when it wasn't dark, I was like, if people were parking on the side of this, if I had seen this in the daytime, I would have been worried the entire hike that my car was going to roll into that ravine. It's just it's a bit of a bumpy ride. I'm glad that the county cracked down on some of the parking on the side of the road, but yeah, then you do get into the issue of how do you get people safely to the trailhead without ripping apart the bottom of their car or parking on top of the wildlife. And that's a long road to get there unless you're taking one of the other less popular approaches to do grays and tories. But like the public conversation has been for a while, it's kind of reimagining these different ways that people can get to the trailheads. And I'm kind of interested to see what the future looks like for CFI in playing a role in that conversation as well.
Well, there's a really great opportunity that we're embarking on. People may know that in Colorado, we have our state lottery that puts money into park and open space projects through an entity called Great Outdoors Colorado. And they had reached out to National Forest Foundation and CFI to say, look, we have this big grant program called Centennial Grants, which work on things that are sort of fundamental and foundational to the Centennial state, big signature projects. And they were like, the 14ers are one of those, but we need you all to really engage in broader discussions with communities across the state to say, what are the priorities, and both the tangible on the ground priorities, but also the equitable access issue. How do we build out the infrastructure for the 14ers, but make sure that it still is accessible to people in different parts of the state? People are, different economic abilities, because, if you were following the quandary discussion, Summit County controls the parking lot, and, the Colorado Springs utility has issues, CDOT has issues, the Forest Service. Ultimately, Summit County kind of came in and said, well, we're going to start requiring reservations for parking, and it's $50 a day. And it was initially paired with a free shuttle, and then now the shuttle costs money. And at the same time, over the last couple of years, we've been hearing from, historically underrepresented groups about, hey, these are our public lands. When do we get welcomed into these places? Now communities are sometimes going more towards the paid model, and like, how does that disenfranchise some people? So we're going to be embarking on a process of some statewide meetings and community meetings and engagement of people about, like, how do we make this all work so that everyone feels like things like the 14ers are open and accessible to them, and in a way that is maybe not dictated by price or by flexibility of schedule or those sorts of things.
I think it's good that CFI is going to be in that conversation looking forward, because one of the issues that I've brought up with how the reason that the 14ers are in the state that they're in is like you talked about, only I think 2 of them were planned trails, and everything else was kind of hikers getting as close as they could to a viable path to the summit and then just going. And so a lot of these trailheads and parking lots are in places where they're kind of crammed in between all these other important things or private property in places where you can't really expand. And I think that it's kind of important as we look forward to expand wildlife access, or wild space access, there we go, in a way that makes sure that we have room to grow these spaces and that we don't run into similar problems in the future. And that kind of takes me to my next question that I'd like to tackle looking forward. I know that one of the strengths that you told me about having, all these tally counters and getting such good data about where the people are and aren't, is being able to very precisely estimate what your next project can accomplish. And so that when you're looking at a new project or a new build or something, you can say, we're going to be hopefully impacting this amount of people, and this is what, the donations are going to accomplish. So is there a project you can tell me about that you're looking to next season, that you're looking to tackle with the money that you're raising right now that someone listening would potentially be donating to?
Well, we have a bunch of different projects that next year will be back on a couple of long-term projects. We'll be continuing to work on Mount Elbert, the main northeast route. We've been there for a couple of years. We're also going to be starting work on Black Cloud, which is kind of the third tier route on the mountains that comes in from a more southeasterly direction. We'll be having two projects on two independent crews, a high crew and a low crew, working on Mount Chavano. That's a project, give you a sense of the growing scale and complexity of work. That is one we started this year and will be on for probably 6 years, and it's probably going to cost about $2 million to do that project. It's involved us having to acquire private mining claims on the mountain. It's one much like Grays and Torreys, where we will probably over time need to be flying helicopters to get supplies up to the saddle, which is in excess of 13,000 feet, I think. We tend to compete very well for grants through the State Trails program. Many of those, and funding from the Great American Outdoors Act that was passed a couple of years ago, will fund kind of the basic crew member wages for a large measure, but we have things related to even as simple things as paying for meals for crews that are working in remote base camps for 8 days at a stretch. Like a lot of our government grants that we haul in that will pay for employee wages won't cover things like food, or they won't cover gas to run trucks to get to different places, or supplies to keep them operating. So as we've expanded this year, we were at about a $1.8 million budget, and we haven't yet projected where we're going to be for next year, but probably be in a similar area. Just paying for the bodies and the tools and things like that is critical. We also are hoping next year to be hiring a person to go out and continue to do the sustainable trail inventories. That's probably something that will be costing us, $50,000 to $100,000, and is a lot harder to raise money for. So gifts from individuals help with those sorts of efforts. Gifts from individuals help with a lot of our educational efforts, our educational videos and trailhead kiosks and things like that help let people understand what's really unique and cool about the 14ers, but also incredibly fragile and requires people to have a sense of leave no trace ethics. That's education is always the stepchild that gets kind of left out from a lot of the funding sources. So those are things where individual donations fill in and help pay for those types of activities.
Could you briefly just explain the sustainable trails inventory for people who don't know what that part of the program actually entails?
Sure. So several years ago, we kind of hit with the fact that we needed to really understand what condition the trails are in, and then periodically go back and see how they're changing over time. We have someone who goes out and will do foot-by-foot GPS-based inventories of the trails. And they will look at, how wide is the trail? How deep is the trail? What structures have already been built? And for those that have been built, what are their grades compared to what an ideal structure would look like? When we see things like trail widening or trail braiding, where the trail has become either hard to follow or it's not pleasant for people, so they look to set out on the tundra and effectively create another trail. Sometimes you can get multiple trails in the same spot. at one point on the East Elbert route years ago, before we did work and realigned it, there was like 7 separate vertical trail braids. That's a lot of resource impact. So with the Sustainable Trails program, we are doing all of this geolocated condition data, and then we're over time seeing how this changes. And we can also put in there, how much time is this going to take to fix, and how far away are materials? Usually we're just working with rocks and timbers and things that are on site. Sometimes we'll have to, bring things in, but there's a cost associated with all of that. So we're able to get condition grade scores for every route. We can, within a given route, break down to different sections and see how they are changing over time and what the cost is going to be to fix that. So it's a program where we're tracking the condition of trails. We're seeing how our investments of time, effort, and money are improving things, and how the forces of nature and boots of hundreds of thousands of climbers are deteriorating things. And it's like a real-time dashboard that allows us to look at the needs of the 14er trails and where we are most effectively putting our money.
That's really cool. Thank you for walking us through that. I think one of the last things that I want to call attention to, you touched on a little bit, but I just want to make sure that everyone listening kind of really understands the significance of this. For Mount Chavano, you talked about one of the important parts, and the reason that it's such a complicated and expensive project is because you have to actually acquire some of the mining claims. And the thing that some people probably notice if they've looked at an actual printout map, and might not have noticed if they just looked on All Trails, is that a lot of these routes actually crisscross through private land. And that might not seem significant in terms of securing the future of trail access, but a fantastic example that we can always fall back on is pretty reliably the DeCalibron Loop, where for a huge chunk of the season last year, the entire thing was closed because of the dispute over access. And so it's not just about building up the trails and making sure they're in good condition, because that's obviously part of it, but by going in and doing things like securing some of these stretches of land for the public, it's making sure that there won't be these long periods of interruption where you might not be able to access a trail because of a company or a lawyer's interpretation of land liability, where that might shut people out. So as we talk about complexity increasing, we're also talking about making sure that the trails are accessible to people and held by the public, and not potentially on the whim of a private property owner.
Yeah, so a lot of people, don't know that there are private lands, and that some of the 14ers are either located, excuse me, on private land or accessed through private land, which can be shut down at a moment's notice based on a landowner's, prerogative. They'll sometimes go to position B, which is like, well, how can a private person get to own a mountain? We're so fortunate in the West that so many of our outdoor destinations are on public lands, but the reality is some of them aren't. And they range from, a couple of the 14ers are on very large private ranches in the southern part of the state. And people are familiar with Culebro, which is kind of smack in the middle of this very large ranch, and people have to pay and get reservations to go there to climb it. But there are things like Mount Lindsay, which is more on the, the back fire escape of one of the largest private ranches in the state. And the landowner was very concerned about a recent court case and a $7.3 million payout that they said in, I think it was September of 2011, said, nope, we're posting that this is private land and people are not authorized to be here. And then they run, so some of those, we're not going to be buying lands for millions and billions of dollars from incredibly wealthy people. But as you mentioned, in the Mosquito Range, the DeCalibron Loop and also Mount Sherman are owned by various individuals or companies that have been involved in mining, which is now largely not really feasible. And yet it's still private land, and that land could be sold to people for, mining or development or other sorts of things. And CFI is actively working with the Mosquito Range Heritage Initiative and the Conservation Fund to see if we can acquire some of these lands from willing sellers. There's a lot of complexity to it, but there have been some very promising discussions. And at the moment, we're working on a phase one effort, and hoping that we can, jointly sort of come to terms with a landowner there. But there are some really interesting opportunities, some what we call pre-acquisition efforts that we've committed. CFI in our board meeting in November committed $100,000 to that we need to raise, but that we've committed to try to help in some of this pre-acquisition work that could lead to an eventual public ownership of 2 of those peaks, which is super exciting. And then there's a bankruptcy case proceeding for Mount Sherman, and preliminary rulings there. We're going with an entity that we've been dealing with. So, within the next year or 2, we could have some viable things on the table where, with enough money, some of these things could be acquired and brought into public ownership. Takes super complicated, many things that could, where wheels could fall off the truck, so to speak, but some really exciting opportunities that could lead to some of those mosquito range peaks coming into public ownership and not having to worry about a landowner getting concerned about liability and closing off access.
So to summarize for the people at home who are hopefully considering making a donation, Colorado 14ers Initiative working to enhance and protect the trails that we have, and also look to the future and try to preserve the accessibility of the public to these trails and make sure that it's something that, as you said, is equitable, so that, everyone who wants to be able to access the outdoors has a reasonable way to do that.
The third thing would be just the educational component of, making sure that people know what is really unique about these peaks, but also, their fragile vulnerability, and that people are respectfully recreating on the peaks. So it's, trying to help protect the resource, educate the public, based on the challenges we're facing now, but also the ones that are, more complex in the future as Colorado continues to grow. More people fall in love with the state and want to live here, and then also the vast numbers of people who come out every year from other parts of the country and other parts of the world, for that matter, to kind of recreate on these peaks.
Well, thank you very much for your time and for being here with me this morning.
Well, thanks as always, Cole, for your interest in the 14ers.
If you enjoyed this segment from the Trail Talk podcast, head over to colesclimb.com. You can catch full episodes, original reporting, independent investigations, and resources to help you plan for your next outdoor adventure.